Welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're stepping inside what I like to call the national control room. Have you ever actually wondered how a government steers the massive, wildly complicated ship that is a national economy? Well, it's not just magic, and it's certainly not guesswork. There's a precise operator's manual filled with specific objectives, policy levers, and defensive mechanisms that leaders use to keep the whole thing on track. It's kind of like piloting a massive commercial airliner, right? The controls are incredibly sensitive. Pulling one lever over here to fix a problem often sets off 3 different alarms over there. It introduces this constant tension into macroeconomic management. In this explainer, we're going straight to the source material to decode that manual. We'll look at the domestic dials governments turn, and then we're going to zoom out to see how they navigate the turbulent waters of international trade.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Our roadmap today is highly structured. We're going to start with macroeconomic goals, then move to the policy toolkit. After that, international trade basics, followed by controlling trade, and finally we'll ground all this theory by looking at Nigeria's specific trade challenges.
So, kicking things off with Part 1, macroeconomic goals and objectives. Before you can steer the ship, you gotta know your destination. So, what specific targets is a government actually trying to hit when it takes control of the economy? Broadly speaking, there are 5 main goals here: full employment, price stability, economic growth, balance of payments equilibrium, and equitable income redistribution. But I really want to spend a second on full employment, because contrary to what you might think, it absolutely does not mean 0% unemployment. Actually, look at this brilliant definition from Lord Beveridge. He defined full employment as a situation where there are literally more vacant jobs than unemployed men, so that the normal lag between losing one job and finding another is very short. Think about why this matters for a second. If unemployment is literally at 0, nobody is seeking better opportunities, and no companies are growing to create new roles. The whole economy is just stagnant. Lord Beveridge is talking about a dynamic, moving economy, not some static world where everyone is locked into their current job forever.
Now, to make these broad goals actionable, governments set concrete policy targets. Think of this as the ideal dashboard in our national control room. Based on the source models, an optimized economy might aim for something like 3% unemployment, what economists call frictional unemployment, alongside an inflation rate kept steady at 5%, and a solid economic growth rate of 5% per year. But here's the catch. Hitting these exact numbers is the ultimate balancing act. There's this inherent conflict built into these targets. If you push the economic engine too hard trying to get massive, rapid growth, you risk overheating the whole system, and bam, inflation spikes. But if you try to crush inflation entirely, you might stall out the growth engine and cause unemployment to skyrocket. It is a constant tightrope walk for policymakers.
Let's move to Section 2 and see how this builds, the government's policy toolkit. Knowing the targets is great, but how do we actually get there? What are the actual levers the government can pull? Well, the economy is primarily driven by 2 massive engines: fiscal policy and monetary policy. And they're handled by completely different operators. Think of fiscal policy as deciding where the car drives. This is handled by the Ministry of Finance. Their tools are the national budget, government spending, and taxation. If they want to boost employment, they might increase spending on infrastructure or cut taxes to pump up aggregate demand. On the flip side, think of monetary policy as controlling the amount of fuel flowing into the engine. This is controlled by the central bank, like the Central Bank of Nigeria, or CBN. They don't mess with taxes. Instead, they use interest rates in the money supply to achieve internal balance, like low inflation, and external balance, like exchange rate stability. Now, what's really interesting about this next breakdown is seeing exactly how the central bank uses specific tools to hit those big goals. You can see they use things like open market operations, discount policy, and reserve requirements. Let's look at how this plays out in the real world. When a government faces a crisis like severe food inflation, which has been a major focus under recent Nigerian economic strategies often referred to as Tinubunomics, the central bank can use contractionary tools. For example, they might hike up interest rates or use open market operations to sell government treasury bills. By selling these bills, the central bank is essentially vacuuming up cash from banks and the public. It pulls money right out of circulation, reducing the amount of fuel in the engine, which hopefully cools down that intense inflationary pressure.
But there's actually a third, highly crucial lever in the toolkit, especially in developing nations: social intervention. In countries like Nigeria, the free market system just doesn't always distribute resources fairly or efficiently to the most vulnerable folks. To correct this skewness, the government steps in through bodies like the Federal Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs. They use social safety nets to actively drive that 5th macroeconomic goal we mentioned earlier: equitable income redistribution. In practice, this means taking resources from higher-earning sectors and redistributing them through concrete programs, like giving conditional cash transfers directly to impoverished families or rolling out food subsidies. It takes this highly abstract concept of redistribution and makes it incredibly tangible for everyday people.
Moving on to Section 3, Basics of International Trade.
So we've thoroughly explored the domestic control room. Now, let's open the blast doors and look at the global stage. Why do countries even bother trading with each other at all, instead of just, making everything themselves? It largely comes down to the inequitable distribution of natural resources and differences in skills. And this brings us to two foundational concepts. First, free trade, which is simply the exchange of goods across borders without artificial barriers. Second is the principle of comparative advantage, propounded by David Ricardo way back in the 19th century. Ricardo argued that a country should specialize in producing goods where it has a lower relative cost compared to other nations. And this is actually highly counterintuitive. Ricardo proved mathematically that even if one country is phenomenally efficient and literally better at producing everything than its neighbor, it still makes mathematical and economic sense for them to specialize in trade.
Let's break down the logic of opportunity cost with a classic textbook example comparing Nigeria and the USA. Imagine both countries need cocoa and coffee. Because of climate and natural resources, Nigeria can produce cocoa much cheaper, while the USA might have a comparative advantage in coffee. If they both try to just produce both items independently, it's highly inefficient. If Nigeria diverts its farmers to try and grow coffee in a less than ideal climate, they yield very little crop for a massive amount of effort. It completely wastes resources. But if Nigeria strictly specializes in cocoa, and the USA strictly specializes in coffee, and then they trade, overall global production goes up. By trading its abundant cocoa for the US's coffee, Nigeria effectively gets more coffee than if it tried to grow it itself. Costs plummet, output maximizes, and everybody wins.
Which brings us to Section 4, Controlling and Protecting Trade.
But if free trade is such a win-win scenario mathematically, things in the real world must be a lot more complicated, right? I want you to really think about this next question. If comparative advantage means cheaper goods and higher production for absolutely everyone, why does almost every country on Earth deliberately block trade with protectionist laws? Why put up walls in the first place?
So, the crucial point here is that governments have a fundamental duty to protect their domestic economies from being totally wiped out by stronger foreign competitors. They need to protect what economists call infant industries. These are new, developing domestic sectors that simply don't have the scale yet to survive a brutal price war with massive, established industries in advanced nations. Countries also block trade to correct balance of payment deficits and to prevent the dumping of goods. If you haven't heard of it, dumping is this predatory practice where foreign companies flood a market with goods priced way below what they actually cost to produce, specifically to kill off the local competition. To fight back against these threats, countries raise defensive shields. They use tariffs, which are just taxes on imports, or they set strict import quotas to limit the exact quantities of foreign goods allowed in. Sometimes they use outright embargoes. They can even deliberately devalue their own currency. By making their own money worth less, it suddenly makes buying foreign imports way too expensive for their citizens, which effectively chokes off demand.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, Nigeria's Unique Trade Challenges.
All this macroeconomic theory we've been discussing is fascinating, but how does it actually play out on the ground? Well, when we look at the source text covering internal and domestic trade in Nigeria, we see literal physical roadblocks to all these grand economic models. There is a very stark contrast between the sterile math of the national control room and the gritty reality of physical infrastructure. The number one challenge listed? Poor infrastructure. Many road networks are in terrible condition, which makes moving goods brutally slow, prohibitively expensive, and just outright dangerous. Add to that a highly inconsistent electricity supply that drives up daily manufacturing costs, right alongside heavily congested and inefficient ports and railways. Honestly, it doesn't matter how perfect your monetary policy is. You simply cannot achieve 5% economic growth if your goods can't even leave the warehouse to reach the consumer. And this brilliantly illustrates how theoretical economic models collide with real-world problems. Because the friction isn't just potholes in the road, it's armed robbery and banditry on highways, which drastically spikes transport and insurance costs. It's institutional corruption, where bribery at multiple customs checkpoints acts as this unwritten illegal tariff on domestic goods. Furthermore, it's bureaucratic delays and sudden, wildly inconsistent shifts in government policies, like unpredictable bans on certain imports, that create massive market uncertainty. And uncertainty is the ultimate enemy of those dashboard targets we looked at earlier. When businesses don't know the rules of the game from one month to the next, they freeze all their investments. These harsh realities severely disrupt both internal and international trade.
Which leaves us with a massive underlying question to ponder today. As you look at how a government attempts to steer its economy, meticulously managing inflation, employment, and deeply flawed infrastructure, is the ultimate key to a nation's economic future found in building strong protective shields to nurture its own industries, or is it in opening its borders to fully embrace the free market of the world? There are powerful, incredibly complex arguments on both sides of that control panel, and how national leaders answer that question ultimately shapes the daily economic reality for every single one of us. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this gave you a whole new perspective on how your economy is actually operated.